Good evening and welcome. Thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Ben Heckman. I'm the Bexley Public Library Director. And so I want to thank you for coming out to hear this timely and important program tonight. Great programs on important topics happen because of great partners and for people like you coming to great programs. So yeah, come on. You could be doing anything tonight. And tonight's program is presented in partnership with the Columbus Metropolitan Library and is made possible in part with support from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the American Library Association. We want to give a special thanks to Angela O'Neill and Kristen Newby from CML, our library brethren in the big city, for reaching out and partnering us today with events, today's events with Dr. Rebecca Erbelding as part of the Americans and the Holocaust Traveling Exposition, which is still on display at CML's main library branch until next Thursday, March 19th. If you haven't seen it, it's really amazing. Earlier today, there was a teacher's workshop here that was hosted by tonight's speaker, and tonight's program would not have been possible without the help of Jody Elowitz, who is the director. You have quite a title. The Director of Education for the Ohio Holocaust and Genocide Memorial and Education Commission. That's how important we get important people here. So please join me in welcoming my new friend, Jody, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to also say thank you very much for coming. This is a very timely subject matter, even though it happened almost 100 years ago. It is my great pleasure to introduce Rebecca Erbelding, Dr. Rebecca Erbelding. Where is she? Oh, there you are. And I will let her tell you more about herself, but she's a historian, an amazing historian. She's been with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum for 22 years. She started when she was 5. But she's done so many amazing things. Her book on the rescue board, which I believe all libraries in this area have in their stacks. And then a new book that maybe she'll give you a little preview of. And also her work with Ken Burns on the American response to the Holocaust. Is it, yeah, or? U.S. and the Holocaust, a very fine PBS production that you can see online. So I highly recommend that. I am not going to spend any more time with introductions because I really want to give Rebecca all the time she needs. So it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Rebecca Erbelding.
Thank you so much. As Jody said, oh, there's a microphone up here. I'll use this one though. I am Rebecca Erbelding, and I am a historian at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I'm also the historian who works with our middle and high school team, so you'll see timeline cards up on the wall. So if you have a teacher in your life that teaches about this, I'm happy to connect with them, or if you are impressed by the timeline, we can get that to them. So as Ben said, the exhibit at Columbus Metropolitan Library is up for another week. I'm going to talk about some of the research that we did in putting that exhibit together and how we tried to answer some of these kind of big outstanding questions that historians and that members of the public often have about this history. So I'm going to talk about myths and misconceptions mostly. Often when I talk to audiences, there's an idea that the US didn't know anything about the Holocaust when it was happening, that liberation was kind of a complete surprise, and that was the moment that Americans learned about the persecution and murder of Jews. Or there's a sense that the Roosevelt administration knew everything, and for anti-Semitic reasons chose not to take action. So when we are putting this exhibit together, both the gallery exhibit in Washington and the one that is traveling, including to Columbus, we needed to tackle those questions head on because these are things that visitors were going to come into our exhibit thinking about. Show them the information that America had, the Roosevelt administration. Having information, of course, doesn't always translate into knowledge. Knowledge doesn't always translate into belief, and belief almost never translates into action. But we could track, we thought, what information was available and when. And so you can see here the big questions at the beginning of the exhibition. What did Americans know, which we try to answer? And what more could have been done, which is what we hope that visitors will walk away thinking and talking about. So to help with the what did Americans know question, the museum launched a crowdsourced project in 2016 called History Unfolded. We asked citizen historians and librarians and teachers and students and history buffs who volunteered all around the country to look into their local newspapers, either ones that had been digitized or scrolling through microfilm, or we have great photos that teachers sent us of 8th graders with the big books in their local public library, very carefully learning to turn the pages. And we would give them kind of pivotal moments in this history, some of the things that you see on the timeline cards up around the room. And we asked people to send us what they found. You know, take a screenshot, send us a link, take a photo with your phone. While the collection portion of the project has ended, it's history, and really anybody who wants to see what was reported in their own newspaper. So we were kind of hoping that, you know, maybe if we advertise collection opportunities in each state, that was the goal. We got 50,000 submissions, including more than 1,700 from Ohio. And some of these, and in the Washington visitors, the early newspaper. In 1935. And in the traveling exhibit at the Columbus Library, you can run out there to explore. Just to give you some examples, here is Zanesville. Am I saying that right? Zanesville? Zanesville, thank you. Zanesville, Ohio, 33. So for you, FDR took the oath of office March 4th. So for you, FDR took the oath of office March 4th. This was the period of time that changes within the Roosevelt during the 12th point. And so you can see on some of the headlines, you know, the Senate Banking Committee, the Senate passes a relief bill, $500 million in direct grants to states. You see the beginning of the New Deal, right? You see it all over the page. You see Governor White signs bill legalizing beer, the end of prohibition. And then right in the middle of the page, German boycott of Jews goes into effect Saturday. It's March 31st, it's Friday. So you can be in Ohio and know that tomorrow, in advance, the Nazi Party is going to boycott Jewish-owned businesses in Germany. American newspapers were so well sourced at this point. They had reporters on the ground reporting back what was happening that often in the spring of 1933, Americans know things in advance. So here's Akron. On May 11th, 1933, the day after pro-Nazi students burned books throughout Germany, there are pictures on the front page here. 300 Nazis join salute to Hitler. And right under that, you see, it's right down here, Germans convert thousands of books, some by Americans, into ashes. So the logical question is, if Americans can read this, you know, right next to news of the New Deal, right next to Prohibition, what are they doing about it? It's not hidden. It's right here on the front page of newspapers. So there are protests. There are protests in at least 65 cities nationwide in the spring of 1933, protesting what the Nazis are doing and calling on the Roosevelt administration, calling on the State Department to do something. Nobody is quite sure what. And so they usually say, like, make the Nazis stop, including the largest protest march. I think this is it. Let's see if I can get the video to work. The largest protest march in New York City history to date. This protest was May 10th, 1933. It was timed to book burning, which again, Americans knew about in advance that this was going to happen. So more than 100,000 people marched in New York City that day, protesting what the Nazis are doing to German Jews. You can see this protest, this is Chicago at the same day. Today, the Nazis are burning the literary treasures of the world. So in searching through boxes at the National Archives, we found thousands of petitions to Roosevelt and the State Department from all over the country. Small groups, large groups, Jewish, non-Jewish, asking to do something. No one is quite sure but what, but Americans are appealing to their government to protest what the Nazis are doing. Here's the people of Toledo. If you see this, you can see the First Congregational Church. You see Jewish organizations, you see the superintendent of schools, the Presbyterian Church. This is an interfaith effort from the people of Toledo. Here's the Cleveland City Council. Here's a stack of resolutions signed by the residents of Akron. So it is something that is known, it is something that is known in Ohio, and it is something that people are protesting about. Let me show you a sample of some of the different articles that the citizen historians found as part of this History Unfolded project. Here is a letter to the editor from the Nashville Tennessean, from a man in 1933 who thinks the news out of Germany is being exaggerated. He writes, with very evident anti-Semitism here, that, quote, "It is hard to believe that Hitler would antagonize the world in a matter of minor importance." So you can see he has information, he just doesn't believe it. In Tupper Lake, New York, the editorial staff writes about the Evian Conference in 1938, is what to do with Jewish refugees. The Every Journal, Every American in Delaware prints a letter to the editor in 1939 by someone who signs his name just as a naturalized American, who hoped 20,000 German refugee children to come to the US outside of the immigration quotas. This was meant to mimic the kinder transports that were going on in Great Britain at the time. And he says, "Is there really no depth so low that our immigrant baiters will not stoop to it to find outlet for their base hatred of the innocent foreigner who comes to this country?" Advocating for the Senate to pass this bill. So these are really strong words, but these are some of the debates that Americans are having in 1939, showing that they had this information and Americans are debating about it. So often, when we talk about the US response to the Holocaust, we talk about it as one thing. America did this. America didn't do this. America is never one thing. We have never been one thing. We always fight with each other, and we fought with each other about this too, about what to do, looking at the plight of European Jews. Emporia, Kansas reports on a new refugee family that has just arrived there, parents and a son, and profiles them. And when we found that article, we went into our collection and found an oral history with the son. Residents of Utica, Nebraska could read testimony from escapees from the Warsaw Ghetto in their local newspaper in 1943. And in 1944, this is the last one I'll show you, a Jewish newspaper in Indianapolis printed Jews, the 0.7 million people believed to be killed at Auschwitz and where they are from. Now, historians now know this number is too high. It was about 1.1 million, about 1 million Jewish people and 100,000 non-Jewish people murdered at Auschwitz. But it's striking that you can read this in the Midwest in 1944. So the museum is incredibly grateful to all of these citizen historians and librarians and students and teachers who have contributed to this project. There is so much more that we can learn by exploring all of these articles, but the project showed that definitively that while it wasn't always correct, it wasn't always believed, it wasn't always complete in public who was paying attention. Another question that visitors and students often ask is, why didn't Jews just leave? I'll give you a very quick answer today. You can see here an image from the gallery exhibit in Washington, which shows some of the documents that you would need to immigrate, which refugees to escape. In the end, it's difficult to immigrate to the US. You have the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, which passes Congress overwhelmingly on a bipartisan basis in 1924, limiting the number of people who can immigrate each year and defining where they could come from. This is the law in place for the entirety of the 1930s and 1940s, largely unchanged. You can see the headline here. This is from the New York Times in 1924. This was written by one of the sponsors of the bill, conveying the intent of the bill. His bill was meant to end the United States as a melting pot. Intentionally granted larger visa allocations to countries from Northern and Western Europe with large white Protestant populations, and fewer slots to Southern and Eastern Europe, where there were larger percentages of Jews and Catholics. In April 1938, Roosevelt combines the small Austrian quota with the larger German quota to provide more immigration opportunities to Jews in Austria, which had just been taken over by the Nazis. But that's the only intervention by FDR between 1933 and 1945. Because immigration is controlled by Congress, and the quota of most European countries goes unfilled. This is a chart that we show in the library exhibit. And you can see in red, by law, the number of visas that are available to people born in Germany, and in gray, the number of visas that are actually issued. So for most of this period, you didn't even need to change the law, but the US is still not issuing the maximum number of visas and helping the most number of people get out. So complaints about immigrants taking jobs, common through much of US history, found a really receptive audience during the Depression, when as much as 25% of the workforce was unemployed. The vast majority of prospective immigrants needed American financial sponsors who could guarantee that their friend or relative would not become a public charge, someone reliant on the government for any sort of support. And that promise involved an extensive, ever-changing, and invasive paperwork that had to be sent from the United States across the ocean to consulates in Europe. There's fear of communism, which supercharged longstanding anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, leading American organizations fighting to increase immigrant admissions to try not to advertise the fact that most of the refugees they were trying to help were Jewish. It was also incredibly bureaucratically difficult to leave German territory. The Nazis delighted in stealing people's resources, taking their businesses, taking their property, stealing their bank accounts, but that impoverished them, which made them not good candidates for other countries to let in. This idea of public charge again. Jews, most of them were either financially unable to flee or unable to prove to a new country that they would be able to support themselves when they got here. So these conditions presented insurmountable barriers to probably hundreds of thousands of people who added their names to waiting lists and were ultimately murdered during the Holocaust. But the impact of the war and the closure of European ports and US consulates has received much less attention. In their testimonies, survivors will often give a lot of detail about getting the visa, about collecting the paperwork, finding the sponsor, showing up at the consulate, passing the interview, and then they would say, and then we arrived in New York. But so they kind of yada, yada, yada over the actual physical getting on the ship, the physical escape. And those testimonies often say, if they mention the ship at all, they'll say we were on the last ship out of Europe. I have found people in 1938, 1939, 1940, and 1941 saying that they were on the last ship out of Europe. So the museum, when we were preparing the exhibit, we were trying to figure out how to tell the story, this very complicated story of the voyage of the St. Louis, a very well-known story of a ship that was turned away from Cuba. Now, the museum has fantastic collections about the St. Louis. We did a special exhibit specifically about that ship. But if we created a case that was about the St. Louis, we might reinforce to the casual visitor that this was an example of many ships turned away from the US, and that is simply not true. So we decided to place the story of the St. Louis within a data visualization covering the time period between the spring of 1938, after Germany annexes Austria, and October 1941, when Germany makes emigration of Jewish immigration illegal from the areas under its control. And the visualization that you can see the beginning of here shows this animated map of the Northern Hemisphere. It shows individual ships carrying Jewish refugees, and I'll explain how we figured that out, leaving European and North African ports, crossing the Atlantic Ocean and arriving in New York City, which is the place where most people arrived. It moves chronologically through this time period, and we tally on this side the number of ships that make the crossing and how many Jewish refugees arrive on these ships. Here is the beginning of the film, so you can see what that looks like. So you can see dozens of ships arriving every month from all over Europe in the spring of 1938. Each of those ships carried someone who self-identified as a Jewish refugee. So this is how we figured that out. To collect the data that made the film, we relied on 2 online databases. ProQuest's Historical New York Times, so the digitized record of the New York Times, and Ancestry.com, which provides passenger information on ship manifests. So during the 19th, had a daily column called Shipping and Mails. The column, which can take up half a page of the newspaper, is located in the back of the paper by the weather section. And a reader could consult this long list of vessels leaving and entering New York Harbor. And you could find out where they were going to be docking, where they left from, and the anticipated arrival times for ships that are still on the water. And so if you're expecting a package, if you're expecting your aunt who's back from her grand tour, you need to know when she's going to be there and what dock she's coming into, because the weather on the Atlantic can change that wildly, right? So in the 1,329 days between March 12, 1938, when the Germans took Austria, and October 31st, 1941, a grand total of 2,862 ships departed Europe, which we included Scandinavia, Great Britain, and Ireland, and North Africa, and arrived in New York Harbor. So the first step was to make a spreadsheet of all of those ships. So Ancestry.com then has a digitized collection of ship manifests of the arriving passengers and crew of all of these ships. Ship manifests are one of my very favorite sources because they provide an amazing amount of information, not just people's names and ages and dates. It lists the kind of visa that they had, where they got that visa, so you can see that in columns 12 and 13, the date that they got their visa, their closest relative still in Europe, where they are going in the United States. Often that's a way, if your family immigrated, that's a way to find out who your financial sponsor might have been, is where you are headed in the US. The vast majority of the ships in question were included in this, in the passenger manifests were available. So the search fields, if you're searching Ancestry, had the crucial fields of arrival date, so I could match it to the New York Times. It had the ship name, and then if you look down here, race or nationality. So that's interesting, right? Arriving immigrants had to select from one of 46 racial categories. The US does not collect this information, like they don't assign, okay, you are Jewish, and so we count the number of people who are Jews. They collected the racial category of Hebrew. This was one of, like I said, 46 different racial categories you could choose from. You could choose Northern Italian, Southern Italian, German, Herzegovinian, Bohemian, Moravian, Dalmatian, and Hebrew, some of the 46 racial categories. So as the US's immigration quotas were based on country of birth, not nationality or citizenship, it's highly likely that this race and nationality question is self-identified. What is the racial category that you identify as? So there are a few manifests where you will see someone write German and it got X'd out and written Hebrew, but for the most part, people are self-identifying as this. Hebrew is an active racial category in the US on shipping manifests until 1943. In 1943, the Immigration and Naturalization Service decides to phase it out because they say, well, Jews are not a racial category, that's that here in the US. And there's actually a huge debate about phasing it out within the Jewish community in the US because that was how they would raise money. They could say, look how many Jewish immigrants are coming to the US. This is why we need your donation dollars. And so phasing that out meant that suddenly Jewish organizations had no idea how many Jewish people were arriving in the US. But It's helpful in this project because by searching for Hebrew on shipping manifests, we could exclude Jewish crew members, and we were able to determine that a little less than half, 45%, 1,288 ships carried between 1 and 805 Jewish refugees. The 805 was a ship called the Navamar, sailing from Lisbon in September 1941. And a total of 110,960 Jewish refugees made the crossing between in that 3.5 years. That statistic is almost certainly an undercount. And I say that because since Hebrew is self-identified, the analysis only shows the number of Jewish refugees who arrived directly into New York from Europe. Thousands of people went somewhere else first. They went to Cuba, they went to Central or South America, they went to Veracruz, and they made it to the US later. So that does not include these people. It also doesn't include about 8,000 people who actually arrive on the West Coast, who managed to traverse the Trans-Siberian Railroad, cross the Pacific Ocean, and arrive on the West Coast. There are about 8,000 people that we know of who do that extensive trip. And it only lists the people who self-identified as Hebrew. And there are certainly thousands of passengers who do not self-identify that way. Either decide that I'm not going to, risk my new country, I'm gonna list myself as German. That feels safer. Or some who are persecuted by the Nazis as racially Jewish, but do not practice Judaism, and assign themselves what they consider themselves to be. So we have, in this case, 58 ships carrying nearly 4,000 Hebrews immigrating from Europe, arriving in New York Harbor in May 1939, the same month that the Cuban government turns away the St. Louis. How many people know the story of the St. Louis? Okay, for those of you that don't, there's about a 2-minute video about it embedded within the video that I'm gonna just play right now.
On May 13th, 1939, the MS St. Louis, a German passenger ship, began its journey from Hamburg to Havana, Cuba. The ship carried 937 passengers. Most were Jews seeking temporary refuge in Cuba as they waited for immigration visas to the United States. When the ship arrived in Havana, most of the passengers were not allowed to disembark. They had unknowingly purchased fraudulent landing permits from a corrupt Cuban government official. The ship sat in the harbor for nearly 1 week while a relief agency called the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, known as the Joint, tried to persuade the Cuban government to admit the refugees. After negotiations broke down, the ship steered toward Miami, Florida. The refugees and their supporters on land appealed to the public, the press, and each lady. The president never responded, and the State Department did not take any measures to admit the St. Louis passengers. As the ship crossed the Atlantic on its return to Germany, the Joint's European director, Morris Troper, worked tirelessly with State Department staff in Western Europe to find safe havens for the passengers. Troper's last-ditch efforts were successful. 4 Western European countries, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands, issued entry visas to the St. Louis passengers. They would not be forced to return to Nazi Germany. But the passengers were not safe from future danger because Nazi Germany soon invaded 3 of the countries where they had landed. Many of the passengers were still on the waiting list for U.S. immigration visas 1 year later. But immigration to the United States was nearly impossible. Of the 937 passengers on the St. Louis, 254 were murdered by Nazi Germany and its collaborators during World War II.
So that's another myth that we were, I think, talking to with people, is that there's often this idea that the St. Louis is an example and not the anomaly that it was. Some of the reason that we have that film footage that you saw in that snippet is that the Joint put out a fundraising video about what a great job they did about the St. Louis. It was considered a success story between 1939 and 1940, and then things quickly changed after the outbreak of war. World War II, of course, began at the end of that summer, the summer of 1939, with the German invasion of Poland. Even prior to including the data from manifests, the list of ships traveling to the United States changed immediately with the new war. On September 1st, 1939, US-bound passenger vessels stopped sailing from Germany and Poland. The beginning of the war impacted ships that regularly left from those places. The Queen Mary, which had been known as the fastest ship afloat, it could make the passage from England to New York in 5 days, was converted into a troop ship immediately after the war began. And so it had made 34 voyages in the 18 months prior and carried more than 6,000 Jewish refugees to the US. That is now no longer in service. So the data we gathered allowed us to see the impact of the September 1939 closure of Northern European ports. It shifted the kind of center of gravity of departures to the ports closed immediately after the war began. But for example, only about 400 Jewish refugees left from Italy before the outbreak of war, and between December 1940. So we could also see, after the war broke out, fewer ships make the crossing, and most of them are German. So we could also see, after the war broke out, fewer ships make the crossing in general. There's submarine warfare on the Atlantic. We see 1,900 ships from Europe and North Africa, an average of 110 per month. But then after September 1st, 1939, there are fewer than 900 that come, an average of 34 per month. By the spring of 1940, the center of gravity. Before June 1940, we found two Jewish. 1940, we found two Jewish refugees leaving from Lisbon. After June 1940, Lisbon. Overcrowded cargo or tourist ships flying the neutral talks about how they have to get exit visas to Lisbon because they get to the free world. Transportation in the perspective, refugees traveling to Lisbon becomes the most difficult part of all of this. You know, the consulate officer requires you now to have a ship ticket in advance. You have to show that you're physically able to leave Europe before you're able to get an immigration visa, which adds another layer of difficulty. You have to physically get to Lisbon, which is really hard. You need entry and exit visas to all of these countries. Of the 88 ships carrying Jewish refugees across the Atlantic in 1941, 76 of them leave from Lisbon. By the summer of 1941, with very few exceptions, Jews are generally trapped. And in October 1941, as I said, Germany makes emigration illegal. So while there is no last ship, there are plenty of last ships leaving from specific ports. The last ship from Antwerp. And Nazi policy inevitably makes immigration impossible for all but a very lucky few. The very last question that I'll talk about tonight before we get to your questions is another question that a lot of people have. What did the US government do once it knew that the Holocaust was happening? I'll start with how the government learned about the Holocaust. Actually, I did want a black slide. So we now know that mass murder began in the summer of 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, when Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union and mobile killing squads come behind the armies and begin what we now call the Holocaust by bullets. This screen is intentionally black because reporting on the plight of Jews at this point is quite minimal. We no longer have reporters on the ground reporting back what the Nazis are doing the way that we did in the 1930s. And so Americans and their newspapers are much more concerned about the threat of war and the beginning of American involvement in that war. And so you'll often see small articles, just usually paragraphs, part of the international section of the paper that begin with things like sources out of the Soviet Union say, or sources from the Polish government in exile say, that this town has been rounded up. That the initial reports of the murder of Jewish women and children, that it was part of propaganda designed to draw the United States into the war. So it takes a really long time for the American people that Nazi persecution has escalated to mass murder. 1942, a Jewish organization representative in Switzerland named Gerhard Rigner learns about the Nazi plan. He tries to send the news through the State Department. The State Department initially blocks this message. They consider it a war rumor. There's no sense in riling people up about just a war rumor. And again, you see echoes of World War I here, this idea that there had been lots of war rumors about atrocities involving the Germans. Those were thought to be false. These must be false too. Why would the Germans be doing this? You can see, though, that this cable is quite exact. In Führer's headquarters, plan discussed and under consideration, all Jews in countries occupied or controlled Germany, number 3.5 to 4 million, should after deportation and concentration in the East, at one blow exterminated to resolve once and for all Jewish question in Europe. In November 1942, the State Department confirms the message. It is in newspapers across the country. In December, you can see in the clipping on the right, the US, the British, the Soviets, and groups of nations in exile condemn what they call the cold-blooded extermination, and they promise post-war punishment. They don't promise rescue. Rescue doesn't seem possible. They promise punishment after the war crimes trials, after the Germans are defeated. Of course, this does not mean that Americans believe this news, even after the government statement. A poll from January 1943 shows us about half of all Americans believe it. More than a quarter thought it was just a rumor, and about another quarter aren't sure. At the same time, the same month that Americans learn about mass murder, the Allies in North Africa, we are now thousands of miles from the killing centers, which is where most people are being murdered. And so for most of 1943, more and more information is coming out. It is being treated as credible by American newspapers. And there's more pageant called October 1943. Just like the spring of 1933, nobody is quite sure what to do, but the Roosevelt administration should be doing something. And of course, the opportunities and options for rescue are shaped by the war. So often, we teach these things differently. But geography changes possibility. And in terms of what historians call allies can rescue, depends on the territories they can reach. And so in the library and in the gallery, we show a map.
This may be the turning point of the war, but the road to this child here knows that Germany must finally be beaten on the continent.
In North Africa, the Allied pincers are slowly closing around the Germans and Italians as Hitler prepared the defenses against an Allied invasion of South Europe.
Under the guns of British and American artillerymen began the assault on the mainland of Italy.
In 1943, there's a lot of pressure on the US government to do something. Pressure comes, nope. Keep going. There's some of that pressure for the U.S. to do more is coming from inside the Roosevelt administration. Begins investigating why the State Department would be doing this. They write a memo to Roosevelt with the original title, Personal Report to the President on the Acquiescence of This Government in the Murder of the Jewish Population. We leave of war criminals, but your administration is at risk here. There is a scandal, and also we are going to be responsible. Beginning in January 1944, the U.S. actually has a policy of rescuing Jews, and between January 1944 and the end of the War Refugee Board will do a lot of things. They start a propaganda warfare campaign, warning would-be perpetrators that the Allies will hold war crimes trials. This is a leaflet that was dropped over Nazi territory from the sky with a warning from FDR to the German people. They open a refugee camp in upstate New York. Jody or Ben mentioned that I have a book coming out next year that is on this refugee camp. They bring about 1,000 mostly Jewish refugees to live there. This is the only group of people brought outside of the immigration laws during the period as guests of the president. The refugees are housed at Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York, but they are surrounded by barbed wire. You can see the 3 strands of barbed wire in this picture. They distribute food packages, about 300,000 food packages into concentration camps, or delivered by the Red Cross to people who are on forced marches. So if you've ever heard a survivor give testimony and they talk about getting a food package towards the end of the war, it was almost certainly packed on Long Island, shipped across the government, or across the ocean, disguised as a Red Cross package and paid for by American taxpayers. And in November 1944, they print a report written by escapees from Auschwitz. It gives graphic detail about the process of arrival and selection and gassing at Auschwitz. It was printed in hundreds of newspapers nationwide, and it inspired, here's one of them. This is the Louisville that they made small font. They got photos from the Polish government in exile, which is a source they now trust. They even have a hand-drawn map of the crematorium. This is November 1944. This report inspires the Washington Post to publish an editorial called Genocide, which introduced Americans to a newly coined word, the word genocide. And of course, the board's work was both aided and hampered by where the armies are. So we'll pick up the film here and watch the last 2 minutes, covering the period while the US is attempting this new policy.
With the Germans in headlong retreat, Yanks of the Fifth Army enter Rome in triumph.
The Atlantic Wall has been penetrated. After the first assault, precariously to a few.
Things for students because they want us to scoop in.
French armored division with new American equipment.
And you can see how
far crushes the remaining Nazi resistance in the city, and the battle for Paris ends with the final turmoil of a series of clashes.
Yank troops move up against heavy American equipment. The attempt to stall the Allied offensives toward Cologne and the Saar.
This is the German town of Torgau on the Elbe. The forces of liberation have joined hands.
Research that I'm showing you is this idea of what happens when we together. Does that show students us? How does this complicate this rescue And I think one of the things that it at least shows me is that the time when mass rescue was possible was the time before the killing began. Because once the killing began, once the Allies are off the continent, the idea of how to rescue people just becomes infinitely more complicated. And so to me, the moment that the US could have done more is really the 1950s, when we should have, I think, opened our doors wider to immigrants. So as I said, in April 1945, Roosevelt tours the Ordre. All the intelligence he had, he's absolutely horrified by what he saw. He calls members of Congress, he calls journalists, he calls average soldiers to tour concentration camps. That, as you saw towards the end, the Allies are coming in from both sides, the Soviets from the East and the Americans and Brits, and out any last bit of labor that they believe might turn the war effort and allow them to push people back again. And so liberation happens this same month that Roosevelt dies. Roosevelt dies the same day that I tours Ordre. And so you have this massive news month. You have Roosevelt dying, you have Hitler taking his own life, you have the liberation of concentration camps, and you have the end of the war, right? All of this is incredibly complicated. Americans are seeing visual, and a lot of the around, and I think one of the things that we talk about with students and that we hope people walk away with when they go through this exhibit is that there was a lot of evidence all the time, that Americans had information. Oh, and Zach is bringing a microphone.
In your book, which I'm only about 30% through, you talk a lot about the relationship between the Treasury Department and the State Department and Breckinridge Long and his association or friendship with Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could comment on that as far as, at least as far as I've got in your book, Roosevelt looks worse and worse because he had this association with the people of the State Department, and he never really pushed them as hard as he could have.
So there are a couple of things going on here. So my first book is called Rescue Board. I think Ben mentioned it, or Jody. It came out 8 years ago, 7, 8 years ago. But it's about the story of the War Refugee Board, this government agency that is trying all of these things that I described. And one of the chief kind of antagonists of the book is the Assistant Secretary of State, Breckinridge Long. He is the one who is doing the cover-up of information that is meant to get to the American people. And he's seemingly covering up information about the Holocaust because he thinks the activists will get their hands on it and pressure the government to do something, and he doesn't want the government to do something. So Roosevelt's relationship with the State Department is by the fact that when he takes office in 1933, pretty much every piece of the government changes, right? The Labor Department to kind of use to work everyone out of the Depression. The one piece of government that does not change is the State Department. In the 1930s and 40s, and this culminates in the 60s later, the Democratic Party is splitting. It's splitting between Northern Democrats who have Black and immigrant constituencies, and Southern Democrats who are entrenched segregationists, pro-Jim Crow, anti-Black, anti-immigrant. Roosevelt is trying to hold this coalition together. So he needs to find places for all of these people around and says, okay, everything is going to change. I need liberals to run all of these departments. Frances Perkins, first female cabinet secretary, will put her in Interior. She's from Maine. But we got to put the Southern Democrats somewhere. Where will we put them that's kind of an old boys club? The State Department, where nothing has changed and won't change for a couple more decades. And so Breckinridge Long, St. Louis, Missouri, Cordell Hull, Secretary of State, Tennessee. That is where the Southern Democrats go. Not all of them. He puts Sumner Wells in, his friend from New York, who actually was a page boy at the Roosevelt's wedding. That's how long they went back. He puts him in as kind of the watchdog in the State Department. Sumner Wells had left the government in 1943 because he was credibly accused of propositioning a Black male porter on a train. And so he was bisexual. The people found out that he was bisexual. That was a huge scandal at the time. He leaves the State Department willingly. So you have this moment when the State Department is suddenly controlled exclusively there. And then Roosevelt, I think you're right, is way too trusting of Breckinridge Long, who had been a huge money raiser for him, for his campaign, or for his campaigns up. So when the Treasury evidence and basically says, like, you can have your War Refugee Board, I don't disagree with that, but I think you're wrong about Long. Now, Long has already been moved to congressional affairs, and so he is not going to do any damage for the rest of, spoiler, he's not going to do any more damage for the rest of the book, really. His damage has been done. But I think that's really the Democratic Party, and Roosevelt has to put them somewhere.
I'm curious what, or if you could share a little bit about as it's been traveling around the country, given current events.
Yeah, you know, I think librarians are all because, you know, the Holocaust can be a hot topic in different communities, and I think the response has been overwhelmingly positive. I think people often hear this over kind of simplified story that I mentioned come in, and I think are expecting to see this like anti-Roosevelt, anti-State Department, and there's some of that. This like anti-Roosevelt, anti-State Department, and there's some of that, and then they also see Roosevelt creating a War Refugee Board, and Roosevelt doing this other thing, and they also see Roosevelt creating a War Refugee Board, and Roosevelt doing this other thing, and it doesn't matter what your politics are. I think there are going to be pieces that challenge you. If you want to think that the U.S. did enough, you're going to be challenged. If you want to think that the U.S. could have done so much more, you're going to be challenged by the fact that we did do some things, and that rescue, as I said, was really hard. You know, when I get to talking about the War Refugee Board, I can't really think of much that they didn't try. You know, and that's me with all of this other years to think about it. They had 18 months to think about it, and to try as many things as they could, and I can't think of much that they didn't try. And so I remain incredibly and so I remain incredibly impressed by them, and think it is a story that we need to know more about, because this idea that the U.S. can change its mind and move towards a humanitarian policy feels like the end of a long, sad tale of the U.S. not doing anything, but oh, there was this one thing, but we don't have to talk about it because it was policy, feels like the end of a long, sad tale of the U.S. not doing anything, but oh, there was this one thing, but we don't have to talk about it because it was too little and too late. Then we lose the opportunity to learn from it, and to learn. Then we lose the opportunity to learn from it, and to learn from how it happened. And I think there is stuff that we can learn from that. And so we have been really in March. Like, come on, I'm so grateful to people who come out and who are interested in this, and that is really heartening to me. You know, that people are still interested in and willing to learn. Like, that has been one
that the U.S. government could have taken that might have meaningfully slowed the rate of killing. Not liberated, but simply slowed down the rate of killing, let's say beginning in mid to late 42, once the U.S. Air Force is conducting operations over Germany?
So yes, the U.S. are until it is just Auschwitz left. And so often people will ask about bombing the gas chambers, the rail lines, the crematorium, destroying Auschwitz. That's not a viable option until the summer of 1944, really, spring, summer of 1944. I think it's April when we first get the range flying out of Foggia to get to the area over Auschwitz and back on a single tank of gas. That is an excellent question, and I don't know. I have thought about it a lot, but historians try, like the second we try to think of hypotheticals, we run away from them immediately because it's not useful. And I don't know, and then my head starts playing out like, well, if we bombed Berlin, if we really like firebombed Dresden-like bombing of Berlin, would that have done something? Would have been a war crime. But the Nazis were very intent on not bringing the war home to the German people. It really does take Allied bombing to start to put fear into German people. So I guess we could have done that. Would they have linked it to mass murder, the German people or the Nazis? I don't know. I think some more forceful statements, like even I showed you the December 1942 statement. By the time the War Refugee Board is established, that's 13 months later, most Americans and most people in the government, even the people who helped write that statement, don't remember that it happened. And so I think to some extent, repeated, the US knows that it's happening, but we're not making any sort of efforts. We can put pressure on the neutrals, and the neutrals have at that moment more power than we do. So if we are pressuring Sweden, Switzerland, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, and saying, we are not going to trade with you as long as you continue to trade with Germany, as long as your tungsten, your ball bearings go to support the German war effort, we are not pressuring them in that way. And so I'm sad to say that it is as unsexy as bureaucracy, but I think it's bureaucracy and diplomacy in 1942 is what we're talking about in the way of what we could have done. I think it's pressure on the neutrals. I think it's more devoted pressure on the neutrals, economic pressure, rather than things like bombing. I think that's where we had the power at that moment.
I know that in our family, my family took in relatives when they came back. But what happened to people who had, oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
That's where
I can hear you.
Oh, thank you. In our family, we had relatives who took in relatives who survived. But what happened to people?
I mean, the displaced persons camps are open until the late 1950s, some of them. So a lot of people have no homes to go to. If they don't have immediate relatives not coming here in 46, 47, some do come in 48. There's about 80,000 Jewish Holocaust survivors who come between 1948 and 1952 as part of the Displaced Persons Act. Many of the Americans, some of these kind of immediately created organizations to work on resettlement, to help people find jobs, get into schools, learn English. So there are about 400,000 people who come under that. 80,000 of them are Holocaust survivors. We can talk about why there were so many more non. So most of them are just resettled by organizations who try to keep an eye out for them. But for a lot of people, after a couple months, they're on their own here in the US. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay.
and at that's a couple months later.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of them join, if they're Jewish, they join synagogues, they join congregations, they become part of a community, and then the community can United Service for New Americans. You would still have kind of whatever community support.
The exhibit downtown shows a lot of the American attitudes in the 20s. So you mentioned the immigration quotas. You have a lot of survey research showing attitudes. There's also a lot of racism, which is still being expressed. You have the Japanese internment that you talk about. Can you maybe just talk a little bit more about Americans' attitudes and how that influenced what happened leading up to the Holocaust?
Yeah, so after World War I, Americans are isolationist for 2 decades. Of Americans, 71% of Americans think that going into World War I had been a mistake. There are a couple of things interesting about that. One, so many Americans, World War I, anticipating not unique to laws. There's eugenics, not unique to laws. There's eugenics, obviously, huge factor leading up to the immigration laws. The idea that biologically, immutably, some people are just better and better morally, that your race, morals convey with the idea of race. And you have the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Some of that is based in this isolationism, based in these eugenic ideas, based in the Birth of a Nation film that Woodrow Wilson screened in the White House as he is resegregating the federal government. In the images at the beginning of the Americans exhibit, we show 2 images in the film, little 70-second intro film of the Klan out to the teachers earlier today, that people aren't wearing their hoods down. They're not wearing their hoods down because they don't need to, because more than 1 million people are members of the Klan at a time when we have a population of 130 million people. And this Klan is not centered in the South the way the post-Civil War Klan had been, and not unique to it's anti-Black, it's anti-Catholic. Their slogan is 100 Ohio, Oregon, places with long, strong histories of white supremacy. And so you get this new resurgence of the Klan corresponding with all of this happening. So when Hitler comes to power, there is a significant minority of Americans, sometimes as much as 10%, who think we should be deporting our own Jewish community. Should we deport Jews in the US? Americans, when they're asked in the late 30s, who would you rather your student, your college-age student, room with? People are more willing to say, I would rather my student room with a German than a Jew. And so you do see this rise in anti-Semitism that corresponds with this rise in eugenics, this rise in racism. But it's been an undercurrent in American history for a long time. It's just how vocal can anti-Semites be comfortably? Yes.
And there's clearly bringing it home.
Right. So when I say bringing it home, I don't mean that it's hidden from the German people, what the Nazis are doing. Certainly there were concentration camps. They were known. They had to be known because people are doing forced labor like out in the community. You know, Dachau is used as a threat. It was meant to keep you in line. You know that it's there. It's right by Munich. The average American or the average German being burdened by the war effort. That was something the Nazis did not want. They did not want the average non-Jewish German to be suffered. Seeing Jews in the streets actually creates a social status, are superior in a certain way. And so it actually works in the Germans' favor to have people see prisoners. It's the protected group, the superior group, the group that you are proud to be part of, and you are told to be proud to be part of as German. But what they don't want is for Germans to be suffering, and Germans to be suffering, and of prisoners who are assigned to sort through that luggage and send things back to Germany to supply the average German from German women who are writing to their husbands who are members of the Einsatzgruppen, the part of the mobile killing squads, saying like, our son has grown out of his boots. Can you find a pair that's bigger? Can you send that home? And so this was the way that Germany is making sure that its chosen people are being taken care of.
Just a follow-up.
Yeah.
Here. So I love how you're saying the separation of them being bad, we're this good. And forgive me, I'm not trying to.
No, it's okay.
But wouldn't that parallel what we were doing with segregation?
Yes, it would. Why do you think Roosevelt can't do anything in the spring of 1933? When they're doing the protests, when they're doing the rallies, Roosevelt can't cut us off diplomatically from the Germans, and he can't even issue a rebuke of the Nazis because Hitler was delighted to point to the US and look at westward expansion. He writes about westward expansion in Mein Kampf. He talks about how the US murdered Native Americans. Lawyers study laws in the South, particularly Virginia's 1924, the one-drop law, when they're trying to figure out the Nuremberg laws. How are we going to racially define a group that is not actually a race? How are still trying to figure out how to biologically determine who is Jewish or not? They can't do it. They still claim that Jews are a race, but the Nuremberg laws are based on the religious practice of your grandparents because they can't figure out how to make Jews a race. So they keep saying it as if it's going to be true, and then the legislation is religious practice. But you're absolutely right, yes.
I'm trying to think about how to formulate the amount of Nazis that have come to America seeking refuge as well. And is that something that maybe we kind of protected.
Yeah. So there's a historian named Claire Aubin who is about to publish, not just on Operation Paperclip, but remember how I said 400,000 people queuing during the war, people from Latvia, people from Lithuania, people from Poland, people from Ukraine, who end up in displaced persons camps, get kind of swept up, mainly trying to escape the Soviets and Soviet territory, so occupation. You did not want to be caught in the Soviet zone. Soviets first forcibly repatriated people. The US declared very early on in the summer of 19, and then later, now that records come out, we are able to see what they were actually doing during the war, and they get denaturalized by the US and sent back to Germany or wherever they were from. Usually, like I said, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, rarely Germans. Operation Paperclip is a little more complicated. I am also not the person to write that book, to bring German scientists to the US.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Sure.
I was wondering, well, and today, I'm one of many, maybe in this room, they have my DNA. So everybody, we know if you want to play this game again, it's way bigger.
It's technology, but the technology that they use were less the Hollerith machines that IBM was doing to kind of do census records. They didn't need that necessarily because it was easier to just go to synagogue records or to ask people who are the Jewish people in your town. Is in your living room in a way that it have a Hollerith machine at the museum. We took it off display because the more research we did, the more we found. That's the thing when we talk about immigration and the refugee crisis, and I should have mentioned this when I was talking about the ships, immigration is a Western and Central European story. It is not people in Eastern Europe. People in Poland, it's the very, very few people who manage to cross into Soviet territory or, in some cases, get deported by the Soviets into Soviet territory, kept in.
Yeah, I want to thank you for this presentation. I think overall I want to thank you for your work on this. And I guess my question is, this work must be hard with the heaviness of the topic, the people you encounter, and what helps you to keep doing this in, say, trying times? What words would you give to folks in trying times?
I have 3 cats who know nothing, and they provide me with quite a lot of comfort. But I also think, and this is like, it makes me feel so Mr. Rogers, you know, the Mr. Rogers quote, "Look for the helpers." But you know, I tell these stories, but I also, I tell these stories, but I also get to meet people, and I think about, you know, and so that is, I think, means more of those people. Maybe not the rescuers; they're pretty exceptional, but want to. There are more of us, I think.
I think that is a wonderful note to end this evening on. So thank you, Dr. Rebecca Erbelding, for tonight's talk. Dr. Rebecca Erbelding, for tonight's talk.